The 2020 NFL Draft is 3 years into their NFL careers, and during every draft process, from the conclusion of the Super Bowl all the way until draft weekend, you will constantly hear that we'll know how this class turns out in 3 years. And the reason 3 years is the time given is because it's plenty of time to determine whether a guy has it or not to play at the NFL level. Guys can peak in their rookie seasons and never be the same player, or it can be the opposite. A bad player in their rookie year, learn from that, and go on to become a very, very good NFL player. And a certain left tackle on the New York Giants could hypothetically fit that exact description. That was also selected number 4 overall in this draft class. But in today's video, we're going to go back and look at what teams hit big and what teams whiffed on their picks and how that largely impacts where teams are today. And there's a lot to dive into in today's video, and without further ado, let's begin. And we are starting today's video by discussing Joe Burrow of the Cincinnati Bengals. There was an immense amount of pressure on Burrow entering his rookie season back in 2020, as during his final year at LSU, all he did was lead the Tigers to a national championship, win the Heisman, and throw 60 touchdowns in 15 games. He was a highly touted prospect, and the winning was expected to continue in Cincinnati, or at least eventually get there, as no team accidentally falls into the number 1 overall pick. And during his rookie season, the team was just 2-7-1 with Burrow as a starter before he tore his ACL in Week 11 against the then Washington football team. The ensuing offseason, the Bengals drafted his former college teammate Jamar Chase, and 2021 was going to be a big test. Could the former Tigers not only compete, but succeed at the NFL level? And we of course know the answer now, and the Bengals hit a grand slam on each pick, and the only question surrounding Burrow and Chase now is how large of a contract extension are each going to receive when the time comes. But not every pick was as big of a hit as the Burrow selection, and some others we'll get to, as Chase Young and Jeff Okudah were the next 2 picks, and the Chase Young selection is a very slippery slope depending on who you ask. He had 7.5 sacks and 4 forced fumbles during his rookie season, won the Defensive Rookie of the Year, and even made a Pro Bowl. And I know the anti-Pro Bowl crowd will say it's watered down. However, there was no game that year due to COVID, so I will say that the Pro Bowl, at least in Chase's rookie year specifically, was a very good accomplishment. However, he's played just 12 games in the past 2 years, and it's been extremely frustrating for both Chase and the Commanders fan base because they know what he's capable of, but he hasn't been able to show it. And he is just 24 years old, and I do think it's very possible Chase finishes the 2023 season with double-digit sacks and earns a contract extension. But as of now, this pick is not a hit. A guy who's played 27 games in 3 years is not a hit. And to take the generational pass rusher number 2 overall and to have 75 total tackles in 3 years, at the moment is not a hit, and the same thing applies to the number 3 overall pick in Jeff Okudah, who is not on the same team that drafted him. The Lions traded him to Atlanta this offseason for a mere 5th round pick, and in his 3 years in Detroit, he played in 25 games and had just 124 tackles in those 3 years. And for the 25 games part, he tore his ACL in Week 1 of the 2021 regular season, which will put a huge dent in the total number of games played, since that was at the start of his 2nd season, and that at this point is a third of his entire career. And we're not going to go over every single pick like this, and not every draft pick is a grand slam of a pick like Burrow was, or a miss like Okudah was. There are certainly players in between, and we can't skip over him, as he has both a ton of fans and, for some reason too, a ton of haters, and that's Dolphins quarterback Tua Tagovailoa. Some people are so confident that Tua stinks, and he's a product of the McDaniel system, and having Jalen Waddle and Tyreek Hill protect him from being the quote-unquote subpar player that he really is, at least that's the belief. And while I think a healthy Tua is a good player, I'm not confident in saying he is a big hit of a pick, and think it's more like a double than it is a bases clearing grand slam. The player selected after him, however, in Justin Herbert, has been everything the Chargers could have hoped for and more in a quarterback. And weirdly enough, Herbert has a lot of haters as well, and people like to blame their playoff loss this year on Justin Herbert, as if he were playing defense against Trevor and the Jags, or at least they'll say he's a playoff choker because he blew a big lead. But having the most passing yards out of any quarterback in NFL history through the first 3 years of their career, to me at least, well, believe it or not, but to me is a huge hit. And by the way, for any Eagles fans wondering where the discussion amongst their beloved quarterback is, and how could we possibly forget about him when discussing these quarterbacks, we'll get to him, and this was more discussing the top 6 picks for this portion of the video. And believe it or not, there were 6 receivers and 6 tackles taken in the first round, and the receiver run started with Henry Ruggs of the Raiders, who is in theory a miss, but that's not exactly the organization's fault in terms of how his career ended. Jerry Jeudy was the second receiver selected, and he is a player who I truly believe could still be a hit and a player I loved in the draft process, and I thought he was the best receiver in the class, as a prospect that is. He has all the tools to succeed at the NFL level and could very easily be a perennial 1,000-yard receiver. CeeDee Lamb is by every definition a hit, as he has nearly 3,400 receiving yards and 20 receiving touchdowns in his first 3 years, including back-to-back 1,100-yard seasons and back-to-back Pro Bowls. Jalen Reagor is the perfect definition of the title of today's video, as he was a clear miss, yet the player selected behind him is a hit of all hits. Justin Jefferson has 3 straight 1,400-plus yard seasons, including a then-rookie receiving yards record in 2020, only to be broke by his former LSU teammate Ja'Marr Chase 1 year later. Jefferson, of course, also won the 2022 Offensive Player of the Year award. Brandon Ayuk, to me, is similar to Jerry Jeudy in the regard that he has all the talent in the world, but can't display it to his full potential because of the team he is on, and because the quarterback play in San Francisco has not been great. And Ayuk is a better player than Jeudy for any 49ers fans that may be annoyed with the comparison, but the comparison stands in the regard of both players have been underutilized as to what they could be. The tackles are all over the place, as they are represented by some of what the league has best to offer, and, well, one of the worst draft busts in NFL history. Tristan Wirfs is a player so good at his position, he's honestly forgotten about because of how good of a player he is. And as an offensive lineman, that in a lot of ways is the biggest compliment you can receive, because people know how good of a player you are. And in Wirfs' first 3 seasons, he's a 2-time Pro Bowler and a 2-time All-Pro, and is one of the league's best players under 25 years old. Much of the same can be said for Andrew Thomas, the Giants' left tackle, as he was a second-team All-Pro in 2022, just 2 years after allowing 10 sacks as a rookie back in 2020. He went through his growing pains, but he is now a big hit on a franchise left tackle. The only one here who is a borderline hit or miss is Browns left tackle Jedrick Wills, who goes through spurts where he won't allow a sack for a month, then will allow a sack and 3 or 4 pressures per game for 3 or 4 straight games. He has the tools to be a good player and to be their left tackle for several years, but I think this is the player he will be for the remainder of his career. The other 3 tackles are whiffs, as Mekhi Becton has played 1 game in the past 2 years, and I hope he turns it around, but it's hard to have a positive outlook at this point for him. Austin Jackson, the Dolphins tackle selection at number 18 overall, is a draft bust, and Isaiah Wilson, the Titans' first-round selection, is a historic draft bust, as he played a grand total of 3 snaps for the Titans before being released due to a ton of reasons. Out of the 32 first-round picks, only 6 have made a Pro Bowl so far, with Chase Young being one of them. And for the watered-down Pro Bowl crowd, this is not good, and the other 5, as you can probably guess, are Burrow, Herbert, Wirfs, Lamb, and Jefferson. There are some other players we didn't talk about from the first round that were draft busts, like Damon Arnette, K'Lavon Chaisson, and Noah Igbenogany, to name a few. For reference, I would put Clyde Edwards-Helaire in the disappointing basket and not a full-on draft bust basket, but there were only 4 Pro Bowlers from the second round, and there's a fair share of players that have not made the Pro Bowl from the second round that very easily could, like T. Higgins, Michael Pittman, and Josh Uche, to name a few. and for any Panthers fans, Jeremy Chin could as well, who is a very underrated player. The Pro Bowlers from the second round were Jonathan Taylor, Antoine Winfield Jr., Trayvon Diggs, and Jalen Hurts. The hit or miss part also extends to the second round, as the hit rate on second round picks is obviously less than what the hit on first round picks are, and that's how it should be. But the picks before Jonathan Taylor were defensive tackle Ross Blacklock, who is no longer a part of the Texans organization, and Laviska Shenault, who is no longer a part of the Jags organization. I personally think the hit or miss aspect of the draft was more pronounced with the 2020 class than perhaps any other class in draft history, because this was during the peak of COVID. If you guys remember watching this draft live, there were cameras set up in the head coach and GM's homes, meaning there was no war room. There was no scout that could pound the table in front of everyone to make a case for his guy. That could have been the Eagles choosing Justin Jefferson over Jalen Reagor, for example, or in an offensive tackle's case, Jedrick Wills over Tristan Wirfs. So why I think this is more pronounced is a lot of these first round picks that ended up either being stars or disappointing players were thrust in because they were first round picks, and the organization had to see what these guys had because they invested so much in them. The Eagles missed on Reagor, and everyone gets their jokes in about that, but they do not get enough credit for building Jalen Hurts and developing a quarterback the way a franchise should in today's NFL. Obviously, a quarterback has to have the ability to play at the NFL level, but placing a great offensive line around him and two good receivers, and even trading for A.J. Brown when they did, helps the Philadelphia Eagles become a successful organization, and a reason why they are successful year in and year out. And if you ask any Eagles fan, would it be nice to have Justin Jefferson? Of course it would, but getting a franchise quarterback is a hell of a trade-off they would take every single time, and Hurts has thrust himself into the top 4 or top 5 quarterback conversations because of the near MVP season he had in 2022. And when you look at teams' drafts specifically within the 2020 draft, there are obviously some good ones, like acquiring CeeDee Lamb, Trayvon Diggs, and Tyler Biadasz all within the same draft, or even Joe Burrow and T. Higgins, but there are some perpetually bad drafts too. I'm not exaggerating when I say the 2020 Raiders class is up there for one of the worst of the decade, and the Jags as well. The Raiders had 4 top 100 picks, and they were Henry Ruggs, Damon Arnett, Lynn Bowden, who was traded before the season started, and Bryan Edwards, and none of these guys are Raiders today. It didn't get better after that, and you get the point. The Jags whiffed on both first-round picks in C.J. Henderson and K'Lavon Chaisson, and continued to whiff throughout the rest of the draft. The Bengals completely turned their franchise around, and granted it helps having the number 1 overall pick to have this opportunity to begin with, but 3 years later, the Bengals have been to back-to-back AFC Championship games, while the Raiders made the playoffs once, and the Jags had back-to-back number 1 overall picks, which is certainly not an accident. Granted, the Jags' future looks extremely bright now, but it has absolutely nothing to do with their 2020 draft class. And 3 years later, this class was largely hit big or miss big. Now that's all I have for today. I hope you enjoyed. If you did, please like the video and subscribe to the channel, as only about 25% of people watching are subscribed. So if you are enjoying, please help the channel out. It only takes a second and would be very much appreciated. Comment your thoughts on this draft class, and until next time, please be safe and have a great day. Love you guys.